Good afternoon from the Folke Bernadotte Academy in Stockholm. My name is Pernilla Rydén. I'm a senior advisor on peace processes for the Folke Bernadotte Academy, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Volker Perthes, who is a former UN Special Representative of the SRSG for Sudan and head of the latest UN mission to Sudan, UNITAMS, but also a renowned academic scholar and political analyst and diplomat. So I'm really, really grateful for having you here in the studio with me today.
Thanks, Pernilla. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I thought, to set the scene, maybe I could ask you a rather personal question. What was your expectations when you went into Sudan for the mission? And what was your feeling when you left the mission in 2020?
Well, of course, there was quite a difference. I went to Sudan with a mandate from the Security Council to lead a mission which was supposed to work with the civilian government on the transition, as we called it, shorthand for a triple transition from authoritarianism to a more pluralist civilian governance, from internal wars to peace, and from economic mismanagement to sustainable development. And we made a lot of efforts and some progress in the first months, and came a military coup. Then we basically had to redefine our purpose, trying to facilitate conversations between the military and the civilians to set the path, or help the Sudanese set the path for a return to civilian governance. And instead of that happening, we witnessed the outbreak of a war which we were not able to prevent, nor were we able to de-escalate before or after the outbreak of the war. So leaving Sudan was, of course, a lot of disappointment about a task not being fulfilled for whatever the reasons were, and a lot of distress, seeing a country which myself and my family lived in for 2 years, and we had loved to be there. We had friends there. We had contacts. I had a kid in school, so of course it was very, very difficult also for the family to leave and leave friends behind.
Mm. And you had to leave a bit on a not so favorable terms as well, if I understand it correctly.
Well, that's true. I mean, there's politics coming in between, and while I was outside the country to brief the Security Council, basically on my way back, the Foreign Ministry in Port Sudan, where they were located shortly after the war broke, I decided to declare me persona non grata, so which means that you cannot, even if you are still the representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations, you cannot physically return to the country.
Yes, very hard situation indeed. But I thought we will move now into discussing some of the lessons that you learned from your tenure with UNITAMS. And one of the lessons you write about in your paper is about not to underestimate the strength of those who reject the process. I find it's very interesting because it's a balance between being optimistic and being cautious, because it's easy to be optimistic and thinking that everybody wants a change, but in the end it might be hard to win over those who actually want to underestimate or reject the process. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this? And in hindsight, is it something that you or the UN could have done differently to get more people on the boat?
Well, it's not about getting people on board or on the boat. It is more about the attitude of the international community to changes we see in certain countries. So here we did have a a revolution or an uprising against a authoritarian regime that had been in power for 30 years, the regime of Omar al-Bashir in Sudan. That regime fell in 2019, and the coalition that emerged, or the cooperative governance structure that emerged between the military component and the civilian component, they were saying that they want the transition to drive it forward together, and they asked the international community for support for a transition assistance mission in the form of UNITAMS, and of course other forms of support through development aid and economic support. So in the international community at that time, there was a lot of optimism that this revolution had succeeded. Everybody was sort of circumspect enough to tolerate other parts of the spectrum. There was a cooperation agreement or a collaboration agreement, power sharing agreement between the military component, civilian component. So the international community, as represented by the Security Council, basically decided to say, we're going to support it, but we are supporting it with a light footprint, with a relatively small mission, which effectively meant that the resistance and the capacities to resist of those who were not in favor of that peaceful transition to democracy and peace and sustainable development, that resistance was underestimated, and that international community underrated the staying power, let me say, of the networks behind the regime that had fallen. Yes, Bashir had been arrested, his regime had fallen, but the networks this regime had built for 30 years and the wealth it had distributed to certain actors, that was all still there. So they weren't necessarily, or representatives of these networks were not necessarily happy with seeing a civilian transition process which was internationally supported going forward. So they just waited for this process to falter. And when the military fell out with their civilian partners, and the military, actually both the military factions that are now fighting one another, when the military overthrew the civilian government of Prime Minister Hamdok, many of these old regime networks made their way back into power through the back door. And I guess that was not factored in enough by the international community.
So just for us to understand it, would you think that it's mainly this that was the challenge, the rejection for those who previously held power, or was it also an overestimation of the civilian population's need for change? Was it both, or was the one stronger than the other?
Well, I would say in retrospect that the majority of the civilian population, which is not only the political actors or the political activists or the party politicians, were very much in favor of change. But of course, expectations were high, and the international community, including my own mission at the UN, could not always meet these expectations. And sometimes the international community, international actors also create the expectations which we then cannot meet. There are certain things that apply to the United Nations, like expectations from the population in the peripheries, in the refugee camps or displacement camps in Darfur, that the UN would protect them against intercommunal violence, for example, which a small mission like UNITAMS with no military element was actually not able to do. But the expectations were there. The expectations that now there is a new regime, there is a civilian government, that development support and development will come at once, which never happens in no situation. It always takes longer than people expect. That peace would be complete and comprehensive, that results would be seen, or the dividend of peace, as we sometimes say, would be seen at once. It never happens. So you need a lot of stamina of the local actors, which then also tend to differ over issues. So they did, to just point to one of the challenges, the political actors and the military, they did agree in a power-sharing agreement on dividing power to an extent. But of course, this didn't dissolve the issues they had with one another. So the military was not necessarily in favor of dismantling these networks, which I was speaking about, the networks that had been built under the Bashir regime, and the structures of wealth and resources being monopolized by certain quarters that were close to the old regime. And the military was partly involved in that. And when I speak of the military, I always mean both military factions that are now at war with one another. So there were issues inside the military which then blew up later. And you don't expect civilian actors just all to be of the same opinion. Of course, Sudan is quite pluralistic society, and for the past 30 years of the dictatorships of the authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, people hadn't necessarily learned to make compromises or to forge a consensus among one another.
I think it's a very important point. Let's go back a little bit to discuss UNITAMS. UNITAMS was a special political mission, and which means that it doesn't have troops, basically, or a force component, so to speak. So, and you mentioned it yourself that it was a light footprint present that was decided by the Security Council. Could you explain a bit to us, like how does this affect the functioning of the mission, given these three phases you went through? But also, I mean, what can we learn setting up missions in fragile contexts in the future, given the experience from UNITAM?
Look, there will always be challenges, and we have to cope with that, and that's our task as diplomats or as UN operatives when we go in at the request of a government into an environment which is not totally stable. Maybe we wouldn't be needed if it was totally stable, if the country was totally at peace, if they had agreed on a constitution before, if the judiciary was working, the political institutions were working. No, it's in situations where a lot of things are not working that the UN is called upon to assist, and that was the case in Sudan. Still, I think even with a small mission, I mean, I started and I had 30 people around me, which is not much. When we left, we had around 300 because we were still building up the mission, started working, and we were still in a build-up phase when the military coup happened. Now, you could have said at that point, this is a political mission, as you right say, a transition assistance mission, and this transition to pluralistic, democratic, civilian rule has basically been aborted by the military coup. So there is no longer a purpose. We never thought that this was the case. Neither did the Security Council think that was the case, but rather everybody was saying, well, UNITAM should stay there, should do its job, but the purpose has to be readapted a little bit. So if it is not about assisting transition because there is no transition to assist, it may be assisting the Sudanese to get back to a transition situation or to civilian governance, which of course made it a bit more challenging. But I think even with a small mission, we did what we could, and we made some progress here. It's more the question of the expectations you have. We had in Sudan, we have to get a little bit into contemporary history here. We did have one of the biggest UN peacekeeping missions in Sudan, there in a part of Sudan, in Darfur, UNAMID, which at times had more than 10,000 uniformed personnel. So UNAMID was being drawn down while UNITAMS came in. And I think Sudanese citizens are forgiven for for thinking that UNITAMS would just replace UNAMID and whatever they got from UNAMID, they would now be receiving from UNITAMS, both in terms of a couple of important development projects which UNAMID had funded because they did have the funds, and of physical protection of civilians, which UNAMID had both the mandate to do and as you said, the troops to do. So they could physically protect camps, for example. They could deter attacks on camps. We could not do that, and I often had to explain to people, saying, look, UNAMID had more than 10,000 uniformed people. I have 21 or 24 police officers with me who are distributed over the whole country in order to support the Sudanese police in a few aspects of their work, which the government asked for. But of course, we cannot protect citizens. We cannot protect people. Sudanese people, of course, did understand it, but there were disappointments there. Other actors would think that the main function of UNITAMS should be to help the government raise development assistance from the international community. Now, we did help a bit in setting up structures together with the government to coordinate between donors and the government. So the structure had just been set up. We had inaugurated it. Prime Minister had spoken. Minister of Finance had spoken. And then a few days later, we had the military coup. And since then, the structures didn't work anymore. So there was another expectation gap. Actually, international development aid was cut to Sudan after the coup because most of the donor countries didn't want to give development aid to a coup regime. Humanitarian aid was continued, but development aid was largely discontinued. So some actors would blame that on the UN mission, say, well, you should help us get development aid. Now it's not coming, so you must have missed out on something. It's always useful, at least we would say that as heads of mission, to have more personnel on the ground when you start, and not just have to start and then build up your mission. Practically, it would have been difficult. There were certain issues in the original staffing, which, or we could call it oversight, which we were able to correct while we went. But, for example, in the beginning, I didn't have a military advisor in a country where the military is strong, was part of the government, where you have geopolitical conflicts all around the country. So these are things which of course could have been done better, but I don't think they were so gross that they prevented us from doing our work.
Maybe then, if we move back to a point that you mentioned a little bit earlier, it's one of your lessons is that there is also a need to kind of improve how we as the United Nation, or you as the United Nation, in this case UNITAMS, but also missions far beyond UNITAMS, counter myths and disinformation. And I understand that yourself was targeted for some myths or disinformation during your tenure. Can you tell me a bit how you handle it, but also what you think that maybe UN could do better in this regard?
Well, I think what we know is that we have to do better, but we don't really know how we can do better. Partly that is because no one really knows how to deal with it. We have a discussion about disinformation, misinformation all around the world. We know that certain actors are using it in a very, very irresponsible manner, and governments, NGOs, UN agencies, we are all more or less at the receiving end, and many individuals are at the receiving end. Politicians, civil society organizations, and individuals. So if you have a situation which is conflictual, And it became particularly conflictual in the last months before the outbreak of the war in April 2023, where you had a political process on the basis of a document which the military leadership had agreed upon with their civilian counterparts, ironically, basically the same civilians they had overthrown a year earlier. So they came together again. We encouraged that, but we were not in the room. They negotiated a document which was called the Framework Political Agreement, and then they came to us, invited us officially, and said, look, we there are a couple of issues which we couldn't agree upon. Could the UN with their African partners, so it was UN, African Union, IGAD as a tripartite mechanism, could the tripartite mechanism facilitate a process where we come to an agreement even on that on those sticky issues? So that was a moment where it seemed as if Sudan was going back from a military coup situation to a situation of civil governance in a negotiated process between the military leadership and civilian actors. And some actors did not want that, particularly actors who had made themselves comfortable, if I can say so, with the military regime. Some of the elements from the Omar Bashir regime, who had gotten back into positions of relevance, of responsibility under Burhan and Hemeti under the military leadership. So there was resistance picking up against that, and this resistance went along with a lot of disinformation. And it started basically, as a main theme was that this agreement between the military and civilians was imposed from outside, that it was coming from outside, that they hadn't agreed on that between themselves, but that it was basically a UNITAMS, or sometimes it was personalized Volkers agreement, which it honestly wasn't. We hadn't seen the document before it was publicized, and or partly publicized by the military and their civilian counterparts. We accept it because we think that's in the essence of what the UN does, and the AU and IGAD. We accepted the task to facilitate a process on that basis, but we would have done that on the basis of a different document too, as long as the military as a de facto power holders and their civilian counterparts had agreed upon it.
I thought now we will move over to another issue that is a sign of a changing reality for the United Nations working in the field, and it's the larger role or the larger cooperation with regional organizations. In Sudan, UNITAMS were cooperating with the African Union and with IGAD, and would be interesting to hear you explain a bit to us of, how did that develop? How did you come to a common understanding of how to work together and agree on, how do we do this as an international organization, a regional organization, and a sub-regional organization?
Well, when we have to go back to the period when the military component, as it was called, overthrew the civilian component. The military never accepted that they had actually made a coup. They said, we just removed the civilian component from the civilian-military partnership, and we continue in the functions we have as head of Sovereignty Council, deputy head of the Sovereignty Council, and we just kicked out these useless civilian ministers, which I think was a bit of a stretch, because if you overthrow the prime minister and put him under house arrest, it's still a coup, even if you do that in your capacity as de facto head of state. So after that, the international bodies denounced that. The United Nations Security Council denounced it, and the African Union actually suspended the membership of Sudan in the African Union, which of course the de facto power holders did not like at all. So it took a while until they accepted, for example, AU delegations to come to Khartoum again. Didn't want that, but we were there. So we did these consultations I spoke about with a broad spectrum of people. We were backed by the Security Council, so even the military government accepted us doing that. I mean, you cannot really do it against the power holders. And then after a while, African Union and then IGAD came in and said, look, this is a situation where it's our task as much as that of the United Nations to help Sudan come back to civilian governance. So if there is a process, we want to be part of it or lead it, or let's find out how we do it. And then what we did is we put together what we call the trilateral mechanism, AU, IGAD, UN, in alphabetical order, to work together as a mechanism to facilitate, to support any effort by Sudanese actors to speak to one another, get into a serious dialogue, and get back to a transition process worth its name, which means civilian governance. Now, that would not have worked if these three organizations, the global international organization, UN, the regional organizations, the African Union, or the continental, as I would say, and then the regional, sub-regional, which is IGAD, which comprises the states at the Horn of Africa. If they hadn't shared the same strategic goal, which is to help the Sudan to get back to civilian governance or constitutional governance. So with that common goal, we could work together. One of the lessons is that it is extremely useful to have this cooperation with the regional organizations for the UN because it increases everybody's legitimacy. Sudan has been a founding member of all these three organizations, so they are rightly proud of their membership in these organizations. So these three organizations are special in a way. It's not like the European Union, which is an outside actor, an important one. But these three organizations are not outside actors. Sudan is a member and them. So together, they bring a lot of legitimacy together. Also, since you always have people who are unhappy with these processes, detractors, we already spoke about disinformation, misinformation. Of course, you had actors who would denounce the UN as basically being a non-African, non-regional, alien, Western-dominated, whatever organization with an SRSG who definitely is neither African nor Arab nor Muslim. So this was nothing the trilateral mechanism could be accused of. So we have the African organization, the representatives there were Africans, were Muslims. So the legitimacy was much higher than if the UN had been working alone. Of course, you need time for any 2 or 3 organizations to get used to one another, to work together. You have attempts, very, very clearly so, by some actors to play the organizations off against one another's or to divide them. But over time, we got used to that and we learned to manage these kind of challenges. We should not sort of disregard the objective challenges that you have when you have 3 organizations who have different resources, different standard operation procedures to get together and expect them to perform from day one when they set up such a mechanism. So in an ideal situation, you would need enough time to have the people in the field, or probably even from headquarters, but mainly those in the field, come together and take the time to think about their facilitation design, about what they want to achieve, how they want to achieve that, which kind of resources they want, how they want to deal with the rest of the international community, how they want to relate to different Sudanese actors. That's in an ideal setting, but of course in processes like the one we were in, or environments like the one we were in, you never have an ideal setting. So you learn while you go.
I would like to continue a little bit on the international partnership side. Like UN is an international organization, and generally when you work for the UN, you work for the UN. You don't work for a member state or a country. But which is it's both an advantage and a disadvantage, because it can at times give UN credibility, but it can also at times give it less impact on the ground. And I understand that one of the lessons that you wanted to share is that it's important to have important international actor or member state to support the activities of the mission to get the support needed to move forward with conflict prevention or peace efforts, or transitional efforts. Can you tell us a little bit how it worked in?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the UN has, and I think Secretary General has said it more than once, the UN has a lot of legitimacy, but it doesn't usually have any physical power. It doesn't have the power to coerce. So our most powerful instrument is our word. We can try to convince people, we can facilitate, we can mediate, we can report, and we can create awareness, which is all about our word. And reporting to the Security Council is important. Informing the general public and member states is important. Shaping transparency, sometimes even between contesting parties in a local setting, is important. So it's mainly about the word. Member states have other means to convince or to coerce actors, economic means, political means, and in some cases even too often used, I would say, military means. So in a situation, and you wanted it to be concrete, when there is high tension and you try to de-escalate by shuttling between the actors and speaking with everybody, you can make your arguments, you can try to convince, but you cannot really, as we would say, knock heads together. So it is then when, as an SRSG or as the United Nations, we would sometimes turn to more powerful member states and say, look, we really need your support here. You have other means to influence actors, and please use your influence, because it's really dangerous, or it's really urgent.
Could you maybe just, without maybe being too specific, but elaborate a little bit further, like when is it like maybe a global power or a regional power? What kind of situations is, I mean, who could be the best actor of support?
I don't think I can give a general answer here, because it really depends. It is contingent on the situation. I remember the day before the military coup, 25 October 21, the U.S. Special Envoy was in town, and he has given interviews, so I'm not revealing any secrets here, and he went with the same message to the generals as I did, and we were basically speaking with different generals at the same day, and our message, without having really coordinated, we had spoken, but everybody had his schedule was, don't do it. I mean, don't go for a coup. It will hurt your country. It will make things more difficult. There may be consequences in terms of international aid or so. So in such a case, I mean, the U.S. with their influence on the World Bank and the IMF, and with their leadership position, among the richer countries, the donor countries, of course, had much more power to bring to the scene than we as the UN, who would basically say, look, I mean, we are here to support a transition, so don't make the transition impossible. It will have consequences, we know it, but it's not we who would impose sanctions. So that would be the US or the European countries. Now, the result was that none of us succeeded. Actually, as to the interviews he gave, the U.S. envoy was told that, no, be reassured, we're not going to do it. And when he had left the country, the tanks were rolling and the coup was going on. They probably were a little bit more open with me, just that they didn't tell me that they're going to do it anyway, but they said there is a chance we are going to do it.
Yes, it just shows us that, parties have different motives for the action.
Right, and I mean, to continue on that, I guess I didn't really answer your question, and even though I don't want to be too explicit, but in the situation preceding the war, the outbreak of war in April, we were of the opinion that, as the UN, we were of the opinion that some of the regional countries probably would have more influence than the Europeans, for example. The Europeans had basically given up their influence because they had suspended development aid, which is a main instrument also to take influence. So they couldn't threaten much. But there were regional countries who were heavily
geographically regional.
Geographically regional, which means African and Arab, and who simply by the means of being neighbors and being invested in one way or other in the country, even economically invested, they definitely had influence on the actors in Sudan, and we would have wished them to use more of it in order to prevent these two military factions to go to war against one another.